Hi, welcome to the American Revolution Museum at Yorktown. My name is Carrie, and today we're going to be talking about knitting in the 18th century. When we think about knitting today, we largely think about knitted shawls and we think about lace knitting, and those are things that are going to come later. Those are more 19th century. We're mostly going to be making things like stockings and mitts and even things like waistcoats and petticoats and children's clothing in the 18th century, but not so much of the fancy kind of lace work that's going to become popular later. Something else that throws people off about how we're knitting in the 18th century is going to be our gauge, so the size of needle and the size of yarn that we're using. Most people today like to get started with a worsted weight yarn and the maybe medium-sized needles, a US size 4 or 5 or maybe 6. In the 18th century, those are all very large sizes. A lot of what we're doing is going to be done on what would be a modern day US 00, single zero, even a 000, and those are going to be done on a steel pin, much like this is, often cut from wiring. A lot of times you're even going to see the needles referred to as wire when you look at them in inventories. And when people are thinking about historic knitting today, I think we tend to think about things like wooden needles or even bone needles, and those are a thing in the 18th century, but they're usually going to be for the larger sized needles and wool weights. They're not really something that you're going to use a lot when you're knitting things like stockings and mitts, and even pin cushions, things like that, because like I said, those are smaller. So what I'm doing right now is I'm actually casting on stitches, and a lot of times when we think about casting on our stitches today in the 21st century, you cast on a long line of stitches and then you just knit back and forth. And that's made easier by the fact we have things like circular needles. So we have needles that have a little piece of tubing in between them that helps us knit larger projects, or we can even knit in the round like that. So when I'm talking about knitting in the round, that's actually what I am setting up to do with my double pointed steel needles right here. I am casting on the number of stitches that I need, just like I would if I were putting them on a single needle, but I'm trying to link them together so that once they're all on, I can join them together and it's going to make a circle, and we'll just knit continuously in that circle, so I don't have to worry about getting to the end of the row and trying to figure out if I'm going to continue knitting or if I'm going to need to do my stitch a different way so that it looks the same. So for something that we would knit in the round, this is going to be something that we would use as a tube. So you're either thinking about something like my mitts here, which have all been knit as one piece. We might also be talking about something like this hat. Now this hat doesn't necessarily look super knit because it's been felted down, which is just going to help it not stretch as much. Also, it will help it be warmer, which I do appreciate. We also have something that could be knit in the round, like this baby garment. This is called a petticoat. I know it doesn't look like what I would consider a petticoat. I'm not going to use it as a skirt. It looks like a little dress. But this is something that was knit in the round and would be appropriate for the 18th century as well as even farther back in to the 17th century. Now, one thing that you see with this type of garment, and that one problem you're going to have when you're knitting, is that it starts to roll. And that's if you have just knit it straight round after round after round, or even row after row. It'll start to curl in at the edges or at the bottom. So to help prevent your edge from rolling, you can do a few rows of a different kind of stitch. So this is what we would call a garter stitch, which is where if this were flat, I would knit it flat, flip my work, and then knit it again, going in the opposite direction. and it gives me a different kind of stitch, and that would be pretty appropriate for the 18th century. Today what we're used to seeing is what we would call a rib stitch. So if you think about your socks or your sweater cuffs, that's what that rib stitch would look like. When you hear people say, yeah, you are going to knit one, purl one, knit one, purl one, knit two, purl two, that's going to be a rib stitch that you're forming with that. And you do see rib stitch in the 18th century. You're just not going to find it as the edge of garments. And doing something like that is definitely going to help prevent it from rolling. Now, something else that you're going to find a lot of in the 18th century is something like a seam. And this isn't a seam that we use to sew the item together. This sort of seam would really be how we're marking where we start and stop the round, because when you're knitting in the round, it all looks really similar, and you run the risk of knitting too much or too little based on what you're trying to do, or not finishing a complete circle. So if you put your seam in, then you'll know where you began. So in order to do a seam, this one's a little more complicated, but it could be as simple as even just putting in what we would call a purl stitch. So brings me to those different stitches that we would have in the 18th century. When we think about our stitches, the most common one, of course, is going to be your knit stitch. But if I were knitting flat and I wanted to make my fabric look like my mitts look right here, if I want to make them have row after row of those little V patterns, then I would have to do a different kind of stitch to make it look the same. I'm going to have to do a purl stitch. So for your regular knit stitch, I know this looks really complicated because I have all those needles in there, but it gets a lot less complicated once you get it going. So for your knit stitch, it looks just like it's going to sound. You're just going to knit it, which puts that V in the front, and it puts a little bump looking stitch in the back. And somebody who looks at my knitting is going to notice that I'm going in a slightly different direction than what most people are going. Most people knit the way that they sew. So most people are going to be going from right to left. And that's because most people are right-handed. I am not. I am left-handed, and so I knit the way I sew, and I'm going to the right. I start on the left and I move to the right. I'm doing a style that is usually referred to as knitting in the English style, and that's where I take the yarn and I'm just wrapping it around the needle. You could also knit continental, which is generally a little faster because instead of taking it and stopping and wrapping it around the needle, what you would do is you would hold it on the other side and you would have to pick it up, and I'm really bad at it. It's because I don't practice. As with anything, you have to practice these things. But if you know what you're doing, that's a lot faster than having to stop and constantly throw it. A lot of knitting in the round, like what I'm doing now, would be done on the farm, or at least at home. But going back as far as the 1580s, there actually was an attempt at making it more industrial. So a guy named William Lee invented what's considered to be the first knitting machine, and it was for knitting socks or stockings. And he, as the story goes, he took this machine to Queen Elizabeth I and was very excited. He said, "Look what I found to make life easier for all of the English people." And she says, "Thanks, but no thanks. We're going to stick with what we got," because even though it wasn't what we would consider an industrial scale, there were so many people in England that were knitting by hand that she didn't want to disrupt that. So William Lee had to take his knitting machine over to France, And by the 18th century, you could definitely buy machine knit items. So whereas I'm knitting socks right now, or I'm knitting stockings right now, they could be machine knit at this time. There are going to be other items of clothing that would be machine knitted. There were some really great examples at the Victoria and Albert Museum from a little bit later than the 1770s, 1780s, so we're talking 1790s. There's some really great examples of knit breeches that men would wear. Starts to become very fashionable to have very tightly fitted breeches, and that's how they were achieving that fit. Knitting is often done, at least by today's standards, often done with wool, and it's definitely one thing we would do in the 18th century as well. You can knit with other fibers too. A lot of times people like to give dishcloths as wedding presents these days, or Christmas presents, and you're not going to knit those with wool. Try cleaning up a spill with wool, it's not going to go very well. So what you would want to do is make those out of something like cotton, or even better, linen. Those are going to be other things that we can knit with, and in the time period you would even see references to linen hose or linen stockings, and those would still be knit. They would just probably be made out of linen and not out of wool. You can also knit out of silk. There are a lot of different items you could knit out of silk. So if you're thinking about those knit breeches I mentioned a minute ago, those could very easily be made out of silk, but so could stockings. So could things like pin cushions. So when we're thinking about something like a pin cushion, more so than we're thinking about something like a stocking, we might think of a design, and there are different ways of putting designs in our knit garments as well. Now, something like a cable or something like that is not necessarily appropriate. That kind of goes along with the knitwear, essentially, or the lace knitwear. It becomes more common a little bit later. Not to say it's not around at all, just not common. But one way of putting a design into a knit item would be to start knitting with a different color. So you'll often see something like, even on my stockings, where you have a little bit of what we would call clockwork, and that design is put in with a different color. So mine are green and yellow. Go Packers. And that's one way. Another way to put a design into fabric would be to just change up the stitch. So just like we put what we would call a purl stitch in for the seam of my mitts, you can actually do designs with that as well. There is a really great, a beautiful example of a knit petticoat, which is actually more like the knit petticoat that I would imagine an actual skirt type petticoat, in the Victoria and Albert Museum, and they have put different designs in that with the purl stitch, so it looks really cool, and it's one way we can add a little design to our cloth. Now today, when we're thinking about stockings or socks, we are normally going to be knitting with what's called a fingering weight yarn, which is a relatively small yarn. It's actually what I'm using right now. So this would be what a lot of hand knit socks are made out of today. Now this yarn that I'm using right now is a little fragile. I don't know if you saw it break earlier in the video, but this is only wool. It's only a wool yarn, and it actually is not plied together. So this is just one strand of the yarn. Sometimes to make the yarn stronger, you would knit, or excuse me, no, you wouldn't knit it. You would spin different threads together, and that's going to make it a little bit stronger. In many cases, it can make it a little thicker too. And it's a great way of doing it. Another way to make your yarn a little stronger is to mix another fiber in there with it. And today that's mostly done with nylon. So if you go to a good yarn store, or even if you go to Joann's or Michael's or the yarn store of your choice, the craft store of your choice. You'll find your stocking weight yarn, your fingering weight yarn might be something like 90% wool and it might be 10% nylon. Of course, though, nylon is not a thing in the 18th century. Nylon is invented in the 1930s, actually. So that's not something that our 18th century counterparts would be doing. They're either going to do something like maybe put a little bit of silk into it, that might give it a little added strength, or they're just going to constantly be darning their stockings. If learning more about 18th century textiles is something you are into, please let us know so we can know what sort of videos to provide for you. So whether it be more videos on knitting, or whether it be videos on embroidery or sewing or weaving or spinning, just let us know. Also, please feel free to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can keep up to date on other videos that we are doing. And don't forget to subscribe to our Facebook and Twitter and Instagram accounts for more information on what's going on at the American Revolution Museum at Yorktown. Started off okay. And a lot of times you're not even knitting them flat. That sounded worse.
Just try again. I won't even cut it. Just try again. And follow us on our other social media. Oh, great.
Oh yeah. Follow us. I'm sorry.
Understudy.